What if I told you that the smiling housewives of the 1950s weren't actually happy? What if their perfect composure, their spotless homes, and their endless patience were all manufactured by a tiny pill that doctors handed out like candy? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. And the psychological manipulation that made an entire generation of women dependent on tranquilizers reveals something disturbing about how society controls people through the illusion of perfection. Before we dive into the darkest corners of suburban America, I need you to do something. Look around your own life right now. How many things are you doing simply because society expects it? How many smiles are you faking? How much of your happiness is real and how much is performance? The answers might terrify you because what happened in the 1950s isn't just history. It's a warning about the invisible chains we still wear today. If you're ready to see behind the curtain of one of history's most successful psychological experiments on women, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want to explore more uncomfortable truths that history tried to bury. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you think we've really moved past this era, or if we've just gotten better at hiding the pills. Now, silence your phone, get comfortable, and prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the good old days. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't just disturbing. It's still happening, just in different forms. Part 1. The Illusion of Perfection, the 1950s myth. Let's shatter the first illusion. The 1950s weren't a golden age. They were a carefully constructed psychological prison painted in pastel colors and wrapped in pearl necklaces. Every image you've seen of smiling housewives serving perfect dinners was propaganda, a collective lie so successful that people still romanticize this era today. Here's what they don't tell you in the history books. The 1950s housewife was the first generation of American women deliberately engineered for pharmaceutical dependency. After World War II, millions of women who had worked in factories, managed offices, and kept the country running were forcibly sent back to domestic life. They went from contributing to the war effort to being confined to kitchens and nurseries. The psychological trauma of this regression was massive, but society couldn't acknowledge it without admitting that the entire social structure was fundamentally broken. So instead of fixing the problem, they medicated the symptoms. Doctors, almost exclusively male, were given a new tool: benzodiazepines and barbiturates marketed specifically for the nervous housewife. The pharmaceutical companies didn't even try to hide it. Their advertisements showed exhausted women being rescued by pills with slogans like, "You can't set her free, but you can make her feel better about it." Think about the psychological manipulation at work here. Society created impossible standards. Be perfectly beautiful, maintain a spotless home, raise perfect children, satisfy your husband, never complain, never show anger, never admit exhaustion. Then, when women inevitably cracked under these impossible demands, the solution wasn't to question the demands. The solution was to drug the women until they could smile through it. This wasn't healthcare. This was social control through chemistry. And it worked so effectively that millions of women never questioned whether the problem was them or the system crushing them. They just took their pills, put on their smiles, and performed happiness until the performance became indistinguishable from reality. The dark psychology behind this goes even deeper. By medicalizing women's completely rational response to oppression, society accomplished something sinister. They made women blame themselves for systemic problems. You're not unhappy because your life is suffocating. You're unhappy because your nerves are bad. You don't need freedom or purpose or recognition. You need medicine. You need to be fixed. This is gaslighting on a societal scale. And the most disturbing part, most women genuinely believed they were the problem. They looked at the magazine photographs, at their neighbors' perfect exteriors, and thought, everyone else is managing. Why can't I? They never knew that everyone else was just as miserable, just as medicated, just as desperate. The loneliness was built into the system. The pharmaceutical industry made billions while an entire generation of women lost themselves in a chemical haze. The advertisements promised peace of mind and restored tranquility, but what they really delivered was emotional numbness and the ability to tolerate intolerable circumstances. The pills didn't make women happy. They made women compliant. And here's where it gets truly dark. The medical establishment knew exactly what they were doing. Research from that era shows doctors were fully aware these medications were addictive, that they caused cognitive impairment, that they were being overprescribed. But the alternative was confronting the fact that American society was built on the oppression of half its population. It was easier to keep writing prescriptions than to question why so many women needed them. This wasn't just about individual doctors being careless. This was systematic, institutionalized psychological abuse disguised as modern medicine. Women who resisted, who refused the pills, or who spoke too loudly about their unhappiness were often labeled hysterical or neurotic. Some were even institutionalized. The message was clear: conform or be removed. The perfection you see in those old photographs isn't real. It's a mask held in place by medication and terror. Behind every gleaming kitchen and flawless hairstyle was a woman suffocating under the weight of expectations she could never meet, drugged into submission, and convinced that her suffering was her own fault. Part 2. The daily routine of pharmaceutical dependency. Now let's walk through a typical day and expose the disturbing reality behind each perfect moment. This isn't speculation. This is based on documented accounts, medical records, and the testimonies of women who finally broke their silence decades later. Morning, the chemical awakening. The day begins not with natural energy or genuine enthusiasm, but with a pill taken the night before still working its way through the system. These weren't supplements. These were powerful psychoactive drugs that fundamentally altered brain chemistry. The calm that women felt wasn't peace. It was suppression of their body's natural stress response. Here's the psychological trap. The morning routine was designed to be impossible without chemical assistance. Wake up before everyone else, look perfect despite getting minimal sleep, prepare an elaborate breakfast, get children ready, please a demanding husband, and do it all with a smile. A normal human being would feel overwhelmed. But women were taught that feeling overwhelmed meant they were failing, not that the demands were unreasonable. The pill didn't make these tasks easier. It just disconnected women from their own legitimate feelings of exhaustion and resentment. They could perform the motions while emotionally flatlined. Their hands worked, their mouths smiled, but inside they were disappearing. Mid-morning, the housework trance. Cleaning became a form of meditation, but not the healthy kind. It was dissociation disguised as domesticity. Women would spend hours on tasks that didn't need doing, finding dust that wasn't there, reorganizing already organized closets. Why? Because the alternative was sitting still with their own thoughts, and their thoughts, unmedicated, were unbearable. The pharmaceutical companies understood this perfectly. Their advertisements didn't just promise clean homes. They promised escape from existential dread through the combination of repetitive physical labor and mood-altering drugs. Clean enough and take enough pills, and you won't have to think about what your life has become. The dark psychology here is that productive-looking activity masked complete stagnation. Women were moving constantly but going nowhere. They were busy but accomplishing nothing meaningful, and society applauded them for it as long as they kept smiling. Midday social performance. The bridge clubs, the Tupperware parties, the neighborhood coffee gatherings. These weren't social support systems. They were mutual surveillance operations where women policed each other's conformity. Anyone who showed too much genuine emotion, who complained too honestly, who let the mask slip, was socially punished through gossip and ostracism. And here's the truly insidious part. These gatherings reinforced pharmaceutical dependency. Women would subtly compete over who was handling things better, who was more composed, who was more perfect. Nobody admitted they were medicated. Everyone pretended their calm was natural. So women who were struggling would think, they're managing without help. I must be especially weak if I need pills. Meanwhile, everyone needed pills. The entire room was collectively lying about their chemical dependency. This created a feedback loop of shame and secrecy. The more dependent women became on medication, the more they had to hide it, and the more they hid it, the more abnormal they felt for needing it. The isolation was crushing, and it was engineered. Afternoon, the loneliness peak. When children were at school and husbands were at work, women were left alone in silent houses with nothing but their thoughts and their pill bottles. This was when the facade cracked, when the desperate calls to doctors happened, when the secret drinking began as women tried to amplify or counteract their medications. The psychological damage of this isolation cannot be overstated. Humans are social creatures who need purpose and connection. The 1950s housewife had neither. Her purpose was maintaining things, not creating anything. Her connections were superficial performances. She was profoundly, completely alone, surrounded by people. And when she reached for another pill to numb the loneliness, she was doing exactly what the system wanted. A woman alone with her thoughts might start questioning things. A woman properly medicated just waited quietly for everyone to come home. Evening, the second shift performance. When the family returned, a second full-time job began. Not just cooking dinner, but being emotionally available to everyone while your own emotions were chemically locked away. Not just serving food, but performing gratitude for the privilege of serving. Not just cleaning up, but doing it all with the appearance of effortless grace. The pills helped women tolerate being simultaneously overworked and undervalued. They helped women smile while being treated as appliances. They helped women accept that their labor was invisible, their exhaustion was weakness, and their worth was measured entirely by other people's comfort. Night, the temporary numbness. As the day ended, many women took more medication, sometimes mixing pills and alcohol, not to feel good but to stop feeling anything at all. Sleep became escape. Dreams became the only place where they could exist without performing. And then the alarm would ring, and the entire cycle would repeat every single day, for years, for decades, for an entire lifetime. No wonder so many women described their lives as sleepwalking. They were pharmaceutically induced zombies performing happiness in a prison they weren't even allowed to recognize as a prison. Part 3. The medical establishment's betrayal. Now we need to talk about the doctors, because their role in this wasn't passive. It was actively predatory. The medical establishment of the 1950s deliberately created and sustained this epidemic of pharmaceutical dependency, and they did it for profit, control, and convenience. The patriarchal medical system. First, understand the power dynamic. Doctors were almost exclusively male. Patients seeking help for psychological distress were predominantly female. The medical profession had just emerged from the war years with unprecedented prestige and authority. What doctors said was treated as unquestionable truth. This created a perfect storm for abuse. Women came to doctors describing real symptoms: exhaustion, anxiety, depression, feeling overwhelmed. These were rational responses to impossible circumstances. But instead of acknowledging that the problem was societal, doctors diagnosed individual pathology. Instead of questioning why so many women were suffering, they questioned why these particular women couldn't cope. The framing was crucial. By calling it nervous housewife syndrome or female hysteria, a diagnosis that persisted well into the 1950s, the medical establishment pathologized normal human responses to oppression. Feeling trapped in your home, that's not a reasonable reaction to being trapped. That's a medical condition. Resenting endless unpaid labor, that's not legitimate anger. That's a chemical imbalance. This wasn't medicine. This was ideological enforcement in a white coat. The prescription mill. Here's how casually these powerful drugs were dispensed. A woman would visit her doctor, describe feeling tired or overwhelmed, and walk out 5 minutes later with a prescription for powerful psychoactive medication. No thorough examination, no exploration of root causes, no discussion of non-pharmaceutical alternatives, just a quick scribble and a paternal pat on the head. Doctors spent more time listening to men's golf scores than to women's legitimate health concerns. The average appointment for a housewife complaining of nerves lasted under 10 minutes. There was no time for genuine care. There was only time for the prescription pad. And the prescriptions kept coming. Refills were automatic. Dosages increased when tolerance developed. Multiple medications were combined with no consideration for interactions. Women were treated as chemistry experiments, except experiments at least have protocols and safety measures. The willful ignorance. What makes this unforgivable is that the medical community knew these drugs were dangerous. Research papers from the early 1950s documented addiction, cognitive impairment, increased suicide risk, and severe withdrawal symptoms. This information was available. It was just ignored because acknowledging it would have required admitting that the medical establishment was mass-prescribing addictive drugs to keep women compliant. Think about the cognitive dissonance required here. Doctors took an oath to do no harm, then systematically harmed millions of women by hooking them on medications that the doctors themselves knew were dangerous. They did this knowingly, deliberately, for decades. Why follow the money? Pharmaceutical companies were making billions. Doctors received incentives, kickbacks, free samples, lavish gifts. Medical conferences were sponsored by drug companies. Research was funded by drug companies. The entire system was corrupted by profit motive. But it wasn't just about money. It was also about convenience. Properly addressing women's unhappiness would have required massive social change. It would have required men to share domestic labor, society to value women's work, culture to allow women autonomy and purpose beyond motherhood. That was hard. Writing a prescription. That was easy, and it made the uncomfortable woman go away quietly. The gaslighting protocol. When women did complain about side effects or dependency, they were gaslit by the very doctors who created the problem. You're just anxious. You're being dramatic. Other women manage just fine. The medical establishment used women's legitimate concerns about medication as evidence that they needed more medication. This is psychological abuse 101. Convince the victim that their perception of harm is actually proof they're crazy. And it worked. Women stopped reporting side effects because reporting made doctors increase dosages. They stopped complaining about dependency because complaining got them labeled as difficult patients. The medical records from this era are chilling. They're full of notes like patient exaggerating symptoms and typical female hysteria, written about women who were literally addicted to medications their doctors prescribed. The victims were blamed while the perpetrators maintained their positions of respected authority. The long-term devastation. We're still dealing with the fallout of this medical betrayal. Women who were prescribed these drugs in their 20s were still taking them in their 80s, their brains fundamentally altered by decades of chemical dependency. Some never recovered their full cognitive function. Some developed early dementia. Some died from overdoses, intentional or accidental. And their daughters watched all of this, learning that women's pain doesn't matter, that doctors know best even when they don't, that suffering in silence is virtuous. The generational trauma is incalculable. The medical establishment has never fully reckoned with this abuse. There's been no institutional apology, no systemic change to prevent it from happening again. Because it is happening again, just with different pills, different marketing, but the same fundamental disregard for women's well-being. Part 4. The Social Engineering Machine. The pharmaceutical dependency wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect of treating legitimate medical conditions. It was the intentional result of a massive social engineering campaign designed to return women to domestic servitude after World War II, threatened traditional gender hierarchies. The post-war propaganda blitz. During World War II, American women proved they could do anything. They built planes, managed factories, ran farms, led teams. They demonstrated complete capability and competence. This terrified the existing power structure because if women could do men's jobs, what justified keeping them subordinate? So when the war ended, an unprecedented propaganda campaign began to convince women that their wartime competence had been a temporary aberration, and their true fulfillment lay in domestic isolation. Magazines, advertisements, television shows, movies, and medical advice all delivered the same message. Real women are homemakers. Real happiness comes from serving others. Real femininity is domestic. But here's the problem. You can't just tell capable people to embrace subordination and expect compliance. You need mechanisms of enforcement. Social pressure was one mechanism. Economic dependency was another. But pharmaceutical dependency was the most insidious because it made resistance physiologically difficult. A woman who wants to leave her suffocating domestic situation needs energy, clarity, and courage. Tranquilizers rob you of all three. They don't just suppress negative emotions. They suppress all strong emotions, including the anger that might motivate change and the hope that makes change seem possible. The advertising assault. Look at pharmaceutical advertisements from the 1950s, and the manipulation becomes obvious. They didn't sell pills as medical treatment. They sold them as tools for maintaining the domestic ideal. One advertisement showed a frazzled housewife captioned, "Tired of her complaints," with the solution being to prescribe her drugs, not to listen to her complaints or address their causes. Another showed a calm, smiling housewife with her children and the caption, "A little help makes all the difference." The little help wasn't supportive family or reasonable expectations. It was chemical sedation. The message was clear. Good mothers drug themselves into compliance. The advertising specifically targeted doctors, not patients, because the goal was to enlist medical professionals as enforcers of social conformity. Pharmaceutical companies sent doctors free samples, glossy brochures, and clinical studies, funded by the companies, proving these drugs were safe and effective for managing unhappy women. The language is revealing. Women weren't patients to be healed. They were problems to be managed. Their unhappiness wasn't a symptom of unjust circumstances. It was a disease to be treated, and treatment meant sedation, not liberation. The economic trap. The pharmaceutical dependency served another crucial function. It kept women economically dependent on their husbands. The pills weren't cheap, and women generally didn't have independent income. So maintaining her medication supply required staying married, staying compliant, staying trapped. This created a vicious cycle. The more dependent a woman became on medication, the less capable she was of imagining or achieving independence. The cognitive effects of long-term tranquilizer use include reduced executive function, impaired decision-making, and decreased motivation. These aren't side effects. From a social control perspective, they're features. A drugged woman is easier to control than a clear-headed one. A woman who's convinced she can't function without pills is less likely to leave an unhappy marriage, demand better treatment, or seek meaningful work outside the home. The pharmaceutical dependency reinforced every other form of dependency. The neighborhood surveillance. The social engineering extended to how neighborhoods functioned. The suburban layout, the similar houses, the constant visibility, all of it created an environment of mutual surveillance where deviation from norms was immediately visible and socially punished. Women policed each other's behavior, reporting those who seemed unstable or neglectful or unfeminine. This created tremendous pressure to maintain the appearance of coping, which meant more women turned to pills to maintain the facade, which meant more dependency, which meant more control. The system was self-reinforcing. The more women were drugged, the more abnormal undrugged emotions seemed. The more abnormal authentic feelings seemed, the more pressure women felt to suppress them. The more they suppressed authentic feelings, the more they needed chemical assistance. Round and round, tighter and tighter, until there was no escape. The children as leverage. Perhaps the darkest aspect of this social engineering was using motherhood as leverage. Women were told that their unhappiness would damage their children, that children need calm mothers, that a mother's job is to be emotionally stable at all times. This is psychological torture. Parents are humans with full emotional ranges. Expecting constant emotional stability while providing no support is impossible. But the threat of harming your children is powerful enough to make women do impossible things, including staying in situations that are destroying them. The medication was framed as responsible mothering. If you can't naturally achieve the impossible calm required, you owe it to your children to achieve it chemically. Your suffering doesn't matter. Your long-term health doesn't matter. Your autonomy doesn't matter. All that matters is maintaining the domestic ideal for the sake of the children. This weaponization of maternal love was evil genius. It turned women's deepest, most authentic feelings into tools of their own oppression. Part 5. The Hidden Costs and consequences. Now let's talk about what this actually cost. Not in dollars, though the economic cost was enormous, but in human terms. In broken minds, damaged relationships, lost potential, and generational trauma. The cognitive devastation. Long-term benzodiazepine and barbiturate use causes measurable brain damage. This isn't controversial. Modern research confirms what was suspected even in the 1950s. These drugs, when taken daily for years, permanently alter brain structure and function. Women who spent decades on these medications experienced memory loss, reduced cognitive processing speed, impaired learning ability, and difficulty with complex problem solving. For many, these effects persisted even after discontinuing the drugs. Their brains had been fundamentally changed. Think about what this means. Millions of intelligent, capable women were chemically lobotomized, their intellectual potential deliberately diminished to make them more manageable. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect. Given what the medical establishment knew about these drugs, it was the predictable outcome of their prescription practices. The women who might have been scientists, artists, leaders, innovators spent their mental prime in a pharmaceutical fog, their cognitive abilities systematically eroded. We'll never know what was lost, what they might have achieved, who they might have become. That's the nature of destruction. You can't measure what never got to exist. The emotional disconnection. The drugs didn't just numb pain. They numbed everything. Women on long-term tranquilizers described feeling like spectators in their own lives, watching from behind glass as their children grew up, as their marriages deteriorated, as their lives passed by. This emotional blunting destroyed relationships. You can't maintain genuine connection while pharmaceutically disconnected from your own emotions. Husbands complained that their wives seemed distant. Children remembered mothers who were physically present but emotionally absent. The drugs that were supposed to improve family life often hollowed it out from within. And the tragedy is that this was blamed on the women, not the drugs. She's cold. She doesn't care. She's not really there. These judgments ignored that she'd been chemically disconnected from her own emotional life by doctors who promised the drugs would help her be a better wife and mother. The addiction epidemic. By the mid-1960s, it became impossible to ignore that millions of American housewives were addicted to prescription drugs. This wasn't subtle. Emergency rooms saw overdoses. Withdrawal symptoms were severe. Women were taking pills in doses and combinations that would have hospitalized them if it wasn't considered normal for housewives. The response from the medical establishment. minimize, deny, and blame women for being weak. Instead of acknowledging their role in creating this addiction epidemic, doctors started talking about addictive personalities and women's emotional fragility. The victims were blamed, while the system that victimized them faced no consequences. Even today, when we discuss the opioid epidemic, there's often a failure to acknowledge that this isn't the first time the medical establishment has created mass addiction through irresponsible prescribing. It happened to women in the 1950s and 60s. The same patterns, the same denials, the same corporate profits prioritized over human well-being. The suicide and death toll. The official statistics don't tell the full story, but even they're grim. Accidental overdoses were common. Intentional overdoses were underreported to spare families shame. Mixing pills and alcohol led to deaths ruled as accidents when they might have been despair. Women died from this, not in dramatic, visible ways that would have prompted societal reckoning, but quietly, alone, in numbers large enough that it should have been recognized as a crisis. It wasn't, because acknowledging it as a crisis would have required acknowledging that the system was killing the people it claimed to help. And some deaths weren't overdoses. They were the slow death of living as a ghost in your own life, decades of half-existence, potential unrealized, self-unrealized, death without dying. The generational impact. Children who grew up with medicated mothers learned destructive patterns. They learned that emotions should be suppressed rather than expressed. They learned that women's pain doesn't deserve attention. They learned that pharmaceutical solutions are preferable to addressing root problems. The daughters, especially, internalized impossible standards and the belief that struggling to meet them meant personal failure requiring medical intervention. The cycle prepared to repeat, and in many ways it has repeated, with different drugs and different marketing but the same fundamental logic. The sons learned that women's complaints aren't serious, that women need to be managed, that men's comfort matters more than women's well-being. These lessons shaped how they treated their own wives and daughters. We're still living with this legacy. The ease with which doctors prescribe psychoactive medications to women, the tendency to medicalize women's reasonable responses to unreasonable circumstances, the assumption that women's mental health problems are individual pathology rather than responses to systemic oppression. All of this continues patterns established in the 1950s. Part 6. The Breaking Point and Resistance 4800-5800. But here's what they don't want you to know. The system didn't last. It couldn't. You can only drug people into compliance for so long before the cracks become canyons. And when women started waking up, the backlash was revolutionary. The first cracks. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, some women started questioning their prescriptions. Not because they suddenly developed insight, but because the side effects became impossible to ignore. Memory loss, severe dependency, personality changes. Even through the pharmaceutical haze, some women recognized something was terribly wrong. These women tried to talk to their doctors and were dismissed, tried to talk to their husbands and were told they were being hysterical, tried to talk to friends and found they were all equally trapped. The isolation was designed to prevent collective resistance. But isolation is also what makes people desperate enough to break the rules. Women started finding each other quietly at first. Whispered conversations at bridge clubs took on new meaning. Someone would admit they wanted to stop taking pills. Someone else would admit they'd tried and couldn't. Slowly, the truth started emerging. Everyone was suffering. Everyone was medicated. Everyone felt trapped. This recognition was explosive. The shared realization that the problem wasn't individual weakness but collective oppression. This is the moment the system feared most. When the victims recognize their victims, when they find each other, when they start getting angry instead of sad. The feminist awakening. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from millions of women recognizing that the problem wasn't their nerves. The problem was a society that crushed them and then sold them pills to tolerate being crushed. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, named what women were feeling, the problem that has no name. It articulated the suffocating nature of domestic isolation and connected individual women's misery to systemic oppression. This book was revolutionary because it said out loud what millions of women had been thinking in silence. This life is killing us. The pharmaceutical dependency was central to feminist critique. Women's liberationists specifically called out the medical establishment for drugging women into submission. They connected the pills to other forms of control: economic dependency, sexual subjugation, legal subordination. They recognized that you couldn't liberate women without addressing all the mechanisms keeping them trapped, including and especially pharmaceutical dependency. The resistance tactics. Some women went cold turkey, suffering through withdrawals without medical support because their doctors wouldn't help them discontinue. Others tapered slowly, secretly, afraid of being discovered and forced back onto medication. Some sought out the few sympathetic doctors who would support discontinuation, though these doctors risked professional consequences for going against standard practice. Women created underground support networks, sharing information about withdrawal symptoms, strategies for managing without medication, ways to hide discontinuation from husbands and doctors who would disapprove. This was radical resistance. These women were risking their marriages, their social standing, their relationships with their children to reclaim their own minds. The bravery of these women cannot be overstated. They had been trained their entire lives to be compliant, to defer to authority, to prioritize everyone's comfort over their own well-being. Breaking that conditioning while dealing with physical addiction and social pressure was extraordinary. The cultural backlash. As women started questioning the pills, they started questioning everything. If the medical establishment lied about the pills being safe, what else were they lying about? If society's promise that domestic life would be fulfilling was false, what else was false? This questioning terrified the existing power structure. Women who could think clearly, who had reclaimed their emotional range, who were angry about their treatment, were dangerous. They started demanding changes: equal pay, reproductive freedom, legal equality, shared domestic labor. The system that had relied on women's sedated compliance faced furious resistance. The backlash against feminism was intense precisely because it threatened to dismantle a system that benefited men at women's expense. And one common thread in anti-feminist rhetoric was the claim that feminists were crazy, emotional, hysterical, the same language used to justify drugging women in the first place. The incomplete liberation. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We won some battles, but not the war. Women gained many legal rights and social freedoms, but the fundamental tendency to medicalize women's pain, to blame women for systemic problems, to prioritize women's compliance over women's well-being, that persists. Today's antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications are prescribed to women at twice the rate of men. The justifications sound eerily familiar. Women are more prone to anxiety. Women need help managing stress. These medications help women function better. The same logic that sold tranquilizers to housewives now sells SSRIs to overwhelmed working mothers expected to do 2 full-time jobs with no support. I'm not saying all psychiatric medication is bad or that no one should take it. I'm saying the pattern of overprescribing psychoactive drugs to women while ignoring systemic causes of their distress is a pattern we haven't broken. We've just gotten more sophisticated about justifying it. Part 7. The Modern Parallels and Lessons. Now comes the part that's going to make some of you uncomfortable, because the 1950s housewife's pharmaceutical dependency isn't ancient history. It's a template that keeps getting reused, And if we don't recognize the patterns, we'll keep falling for them. The modern medication culture. Women today are prescribed psychoactive medications at dramatically higher rates than men, and the gap mirrors the gendered prescribing of the 1950s. When women report stress, exhaustion, or unhappiness, the first response is still often pharmaceutical rather than systemic. Working mothers describing burnout from doing 2 full-time jobs get antidepressants instead of support. Women in abusive relationships get anti-anxiety meds instead of resources to leave. Women facing workplace discrimination get pills instead of justice. The same pattern: medicalize the symptoms, ignore the causes, make women believe they need fixing rather than changing their circumstances. The modern pharmaceutical companies have learned from the 1950s. They don't market directly to doctors anymore. They market to patients through beautiful commercials showing liberated women who manage their mental health with medication. The message is more sophisticated but fundamentally the same. If you're struggling, the problem is your brain chemistry, not your circumstances. The wellness industry. The pharmaceutical approach has expanded into the wellness industry, which sells women endless products and practices to manage stress instead of addressing what's causing it. Meditation apps, essential oils, self-care routines, all can be helpful, but they're also often marketed as individual solutions to systemic problems. You're burned out from working 60 hours a week while managing a household and childcare alone. Don't organize for better labor laws or demand your partner step up. Buy this $50 aromatherapy candle and practice gratitude. You're anxious about healthcare costs, climate change, and political instability. Don't engage in collective action. Do this breathing exercise. This is the same trap in different packaging. The problem is framed as your failure to properly manage your emotional response rather than the legitimate causes of your distress. And just like the 1950s pills, these solutions keep you docile and consuming rather than angry and organizing. The social media performance. The social media era has created new versions of the 1950s neighborhood surveillance. Instead of performing perfection for neighbors, we perform it for algorithms. Instead of bridge clubs where women competed over who seemed most put together, we have Instagram where we curate images of effortless success while hiding our struggles. The psychological damage is similar. Women compare their complicated reality to everyone else's curated highlight reel and feel inadequate. Instead of recognizing that everyone is struggling, they feel alone in their struggle. Instead of collective resistance, there's individual shame and more consumption of products promising to help them measure up. The 1950s housewife took pills to appear calm. The modern woman uses filters, perfect angles, and carefully crafted captions to appear successful. Both are performing for audiences that are also performing. Both result in isolation, inadequacy, and disconnection from authentic experience. The having it all mythology. Modern women were told they could have it all: career, family, perfect home, social life, hobbies, fitness, beauty. This is just the 1950s perfection standard with career added to the list, not replacing anything else. Women are still expected to maintain homes, raise children, look beautiful, and now also earn money and pursue professional achievement. When women predictably burn out from these impossible demands, the response is again to focus on individual management rather than systemic change. Time management seminars, productivity hacks, morning routines, all frame the problem as women not being efficient enough rather than the expectations being unreasonable. This is the same psychological manipulation as the 1950s. Create impossible standards, then sell products and services to help women nearly meet them while blaming them for falling short. Keep them running on a treadmill, too exhausted to notice the treadmill is the problem. The addiction cycles. The opioid epidemic disproportionately affects women and shares disturbing similarities with the 1950s tranquilizer epidemic. Doctors overprescribe pain medication to women. Women become addicted. And then women are blamed for being addicts, while the pharmaceutical companies and complicit doctors face minimal consequences. The patterns are identical. Women's pain isn't taken seriously, so they need pills to function. The pills create dependency. Dependency is stigmatized. Women hide their dependency out of shame. The hiding prevents collective recognition of the systemic problem. The cycle continues. What we can learn. The lesson from the 1950s isn't never take medication. It's question who benefits from medicating your response to unjust circumstances. It's recognize when you're being sold individual solutions to collective problems. It's understand that making you believe you need fixing is a form of social control. When you're struggling, ask yourself, is this a medical problem or a circumstantial problem? Are my circumstances reasonable? Am I being expected to do the impossible and then being told the problem is my failure to achieve it? Is the solution being offered addressing the root cause or just helping me tolerate the symptoms? These questions are radical because they shift blame from individuals back to systems. And systems don't want to be blamed because then systems might have to change. The power of collective recognition. The most powerful moment in the 1950s women's liberation wasn't when individuals recognized their oppression. It was when they recognized it collectively. When women stopped thinking, I'm struggling, and started thinking, we're being oppressed, everything changed. This is what the system fears most: collective consciousness leading to collective action. As long as problems are framed as individual, solutions remain individual. Purchase this, take that, work harder, manage better. But when problems are recognized as collective, solutions become collective. Organize, demand change, refuse compliance, build alternatives. The 1950s housewives eventually got there. They stopped taking their pills, started talking to each other, recognized their shared oppression, and fought back. The modern question is, how long will it take us to recognize our own versions of the same patterns and start fighting back? Part 8, The Path Forward. So where does this leave us? We've deconstructed the 1950s pharmaceutical control of women, exposed how it worked, examined its lasting impact, and recognized its modern parallels. But understanding oppression isn't enough. The question is, what do we do with this knowledge? Breaking the silence. The first step is the same one that started liberation in the 1960s, talking honestly about our experiences. The system relies on isolation. It requires each person to believe their struggle is individual, their pain is uniquely personal, their inability to meet impossible standards is individual failure. Breaking that isolation is revolutionary. When women start being honest about medication use, about struggling to meet expectations, about the gap between their public image and private reality, the collective nature of these problems becomes undeniable. And collective problems demand collective solutions. This doesn't mean sharing every detail of your life on social media. It means refusing to maintain the performance of effortless perfection. It means being honest when someone asks, "How are you?" It means not pretending that you're managing fine when you're drowning. It means creating spaces where authentic struggle can be shared without judgment. Questioning authority. The 1950s women trusted doctors completely, and that trust was exploited. Modern women need to maintain healthy skepticism toward any authority figure offering simple solutions to complex problems. This includes doctors, therapists, wellness influencers, self-help gurus, and anyone selling products or services that claim to fix you. Healthy skepticism doesn't mean refusing all help. It means asking critical questions. What are this person's incentives? Who benefits if I follow this advice? Is this addressing root causes or managing symptoms? What evidence supports these claims? What alternative explanations or solutions exist? Medical care and medication can be life-saving. The point isn't to refuse treatment, but to be an informed, critical participant in decisions about your body and mind, rather than a passive recipient of expert instructions. Recognizing systemic problems. When you notice a pattern, lots of women you know struggling with the same issues, taking the same medications, facing the same barriers, that's probably not coincidence. That's probably a systemic issue being experienced individually. Recognizing systemic problems is uncomfortable because it means the solution isn't within your control. You can't positive think or purchase your way out of systemic inequality. But it's also liberating because it means the problem isn't you. You're not broken. The system is broken. This recognition redirects energy from self-improvement to collective action. Instead of "what's wrong with me?" the question becomes "what's wrong with this setup?" Instead of "how can I better tolerate this?" it becomes "how can we change this?" Building alternative systems. One reason oppressive systems persist is that they're the default, and imagining alternatives requires energy most people don't have. But alternatives exist, and building them is possible. Alternative systems might look like mutual aid networks that provide practical support instead of just sympathetic words, childcare cooperatives that share labor instead of isolating parents, workplace organizations that demand actual work-life balance instead of wellness programs that help you tolerate work-life imbalance, community structures that challenge rather than enforce oppressive norms. These alternatives don't require perfection or massive resources. They require willingness to experiment, to support each other, to value collective well-being over individual advancement, to build something different than what currently exists. Teaching the next generation. Perhaps the most important work is ensuring the next generation learns different lessons than we did. Teach children that emotions are information, not problems to be suppressed. Teach them that struggling under unreasonable demands is rational, not a sign of personal weakness. Teach them that systems can be changed, not just endured. Teach girls that their worth isn't measured by their ability to meet others' needs while ignoring their own. Teach boys that women's emotional labor isn't free or infinite. Teach everyone that authentic connection requires genuine emotion, not performed perfection. This might be the hardest work because it requires unlearning lessons that are deeply embedded in how we were raised. But breaking generational cycles is how change happens. The final truth. Here's what I want you to take from this deep dive into the dark history of 1950s housewife pharmaceutical dependency. Your struggles are not personal failures. The system that profits from your pain wants you to believe you need fixing. But what needs fixing is the system. The 1950s housewives were lied to. They were told they were broken and needed pills to function in a role they were forced into. The truth was that the role itself was breaking them, and the pills just made the breaking tolerable. Many of us are still being told we're broken. We're sold medications, wellness products, productivity systems, all designed to help us function in circumstances that are fundamentally dysfunctional. And just like the 1950s, the problem isn't us. It's the circumstances. The women who fought back in the 1960s and 70s didn't do it because they were braver or stronger. They did it because they got angry, found each other, and refused to keep pretending. They chose truth over performance, collective liberation over individual coping, systematic change over symptomatic management. We can make the same choice. We can stop taking the pills, literal or metaphorical, that help us tolerate the intolerable. We can start demanding change instead of managing dysfunction. We can build something better than what we inherited. The 1950s are over, but their lessons persist. Learn them, share them, use them, and then let's make sure that the next generation doesn't have to learn them the hard way. Closing. So here we are, at the end of this journey into one of history's most successful and disturbing psychological experiments. The smiling housewife, the perfect home, the pharmaceutical calm behind it, all we've stripped away the pretty packaging and exposed the ugly machinery underneath. If this made you uncomfortable, good. History should make us uncomfortable when it shows us how easily systems of oppression disguise themselves as care, how willingly authorities betray the people who trust them, how quickly we can normalize the abnormal when everyone around us is doing the same. But more important than the discomfort is the question: what are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you going to recognize the patterns in your own life? Are you going to stop performing and start being honest? Are you going to find others, build alternatives, demand change? The 1950s housewives couldn't speak loudly about their oppression. Many of them died without ever being heard. But we can speak. We have platforms, voices, communities. We have the ability to learn from their suffering and refuse to repeat it. Before you go, do 3 things. First, hit that subscribe button if you want more uncomfortable truths that they don't teach in school. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because these stories die in silence. Third, drop a comment and tell me, what modern pharmaceutical dependency or social control do you think we're not talking about enough? And remember, the most revolutionary thing you can do is refuse to pretend everything is fine when it's not. Your honesty might be the permission someone else needs to stop performing and start living. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for being willing to look at uncomfortable truths. The 1950s housewives deserved better, we deserve better, and together we can build better. Good night, stay questioning, and never forget, they can only control you if you don't realize you're being controlled.